Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today we're going back to 14th century northern Italy, a place where a wooden bucket somehow triggered a war. Yes, you heard that right, a bucket. But before we get to the drama, the punchline, or the bloodshed, we need to understand the stage where this absurd conflict unfolded. Because Italy in the Middle Ages wasn't a unified country. It was a collection of fiercely independent city-states, each with its own army, its own alliances, and its own ambitions. Imagine a chessboard with no king, just bishops, rooks, and pawns fighting each other for centuries. That was northern Italy, a fragmented peninsula with rival powers like Bologna, Modena, Florence, Milan, and dozens of others constantly shifting allegiances and drawing swords over borders, taxes, or pride. And behind these constant feuds was a deeper ideological divide, the infamous Guelphs and Ghibellines. Now, this wasn't just a family spat. It was a centuries-long power struggle between those who supported the Pope, the Guelphs, and those who backed the Holy Roman Emperor, the Ghibellines. This rivalry turned every local feud into a proxy war. A conflict between city-states could suddenly take on the weight of global religious and political stakes. Papal authority versus imperial legitimacy. And people took sides. On top of that, you had trade. Italy was booming. Merchants, artisans, bankers, and guilds were building fortunes. And with fortune came competition. Cities didn't just want to survive, they wanted to dominate. Every trade route, every toll bridge, every grain shipment became another spark in an already combustible region. So by the time we get to Modena and Bologna, two powerful cities only about 30 miles apart, they weren't just neighbors. They were rivals locked in a web of politics, religion, and economic jealousy. And that's when something strange happened. Something almost too bizarre to believe. Next, we'll look at the spark that turned symbolic theft into full-scale war. So, how does a war start over a bucket? It sounds like satire, like a Monty Python sketch. But in medieval northern Italy, where pride and power were everything, even a wooden bucket could become a symbol worth dying for. According to legend, it happened like this: a group of Modenese soldiers raided enemy territory, specifically the city of Bologna. And during that incursion, they allegedly took a wooden bucket from a well in the city center and brought it back to Modena. That's it, a bucket. Nothing gilded, nothing encrusted with jewels, just an ordinary wooden pail. But this was no ordinary theft. For Bologna, the bucket wasn't just a container. It was a humiliation, a symbol that Modena could walk into their city, take something in broad daylight, and leave untouched. It mocked Bologna's authority, its strength, and its honor. And in a world where honor often meant more than human life, that was unacceptable. Now, you might think, surely there had to be more to it. And you'd be right, because behind the bucket was a mountain of unresolved tension. There were border disputes between Modena and Bologna, conflicts over who controlled certain roads, bridges, and farmlands. There were economic rivalries, with both cities competing for regional dominance. And, of course, the old ideological division was at play. Bologna leaned Guelph, loyal to the Pope. Modena leaned Ghibelline, aligned with the Emperor. So when the bucket disappeared, it wasn't just about wood and iron. It was about centuries of animosity, fear, and unresolved grievances bubbling up through a single, symbolic act. And symbols are powerful. That humble bucket became a rallying cry, a call to arms, something tangible that could channel years of resentment into immediate action. It mobilized militias, riled up citizens, and sent both cities marching toward bloodshed. It's one thing to lose a border, it's another to be mocked. So, what happens when fragile alliances, ideological polarization, and unchecked pride all explode at once? Let's talk about the systems that made this conflict not just possible, but inevitable. Now, let's zoom out again, not to geography this time, but to structure. Because the War of the Oaken Bucket didn't just happen because of a stolen object. It happened because the systems of governance in place made that kind of escalation almost automatic. In 14th century Italy, there was no central authority strong enough to keep local conflicts in check. No emperor with real power. No national army to enforce peace. No third-party arbitrator to say, hey, maybe don't go to war over a bucket. Instead, city-states like Modena and Bologna governed themselves. And while that gave them autonomy, it also made them fragile. Each one was like a little kingdom, with its own army, its own taxes, and its own version of justice. There were no institutional breaks. So when tensions flared, they flared fast. And here's the critical part. The leaders of these cities didn't maintain power by keeping the peace. They stayed in charge by defending honor. Think about that. If a rival city insults you, and you do nothing, you look weak. You risk losing support. But if you rally the troops, talk tough, and go to war, even if it's reckless, you look strong, bold, noble, even heroic. That's how leadership worked. Legitimacy was tied to aggression, not diplomacy. And when a bucket disappears from your city's well, you don't just replace it, you raise the banners and prepare for battle. On top of that, there were no formal limits on how far a leader could go once conflict started. No checks, no balance, no council to ask, is this worth it? Minor provocations, or like, say, stealing a bucket, could spiral into full-scale military campaigns simply because no one had the authority to say stop. It's what happens when governance is decentralized but ego is centralized. When cities run themselves, but every decision-maker is chasing pride, popularity, and power without restraint. So in this kind of world, was war ever really about the bucket? Or was the bucket just the excuse? Let's see what happened when words failed and weapons took over. So the bucket was taken, the insult had landed, and the systems of governance were perfectly tuned, not for peace, but for escalation. What came next was the Battle of Zappolino. Now, let me be clear, this wasn't a skirmish. This wasn't a few dozen soldiers settling a score in the woods. This was a full-on medieval showdown. Over 30,000 troops were mobilized. Let that sink in. 30,000. That's more than the population of many of the cities involved at the time. Soldiers from both the Guelph and Ghibelline factions poured into the countryside, ready to fight not for land, not for wealth, but for honor. And yes, for a bucket. On one side, Bologna, a proud Guelph city, backed by the papal cause, angry and determined to restore its dignity. On the other, Modena, a rising Ghibelline stronghold, eager to prove that its autonomy and defiance couldn't be challenged. The two armies met near a small village called Zappolino. And the result? Chaos. Despite the symbolic nature of the conflict, the battle was vicious. Blood was spilled. Bodies fell. The countryside became a war zone, all sparked by what began as a mocking gesture. Modena emerged victorious. Their forces routed the Bolognese, sending them retreating and humiliated. The bucket remained in Modena, where, by the way, it's still on display today like a twisted trophy. But here's the deeper tragedy. What was actually gained? No territory changed hands. No strategic objectives were achieved. No new alliances were formed. Just human loss, civic unrest, and a regional rivalry made even more bitter. This wasn't a war for survival. It was a performance, a spectacle of pride and retaliation that cost real lives for symbolic satisfaction. Which brings us to the next question. Why would leaders embrace such a costly spectacle? Let's explore the politics of performance. At first glance, it seems absurd. Why would city leaders rally tens of thousands of troops over a bucket? Why risk lives, drain treasuries, and destabilize entire regions? The answer lies in one powerful phrase: political theater. You see, in the 14th century, military action wasn't just about defense. It was a show, a performance staged for the citizens, the allies, and the enemies. War was how leaders demonstrated strength, built loyalty, and kept the political machine running. And nothing captured public imagination like the idea of righteous revenge. By turning the stolen bucket into a symbol of defiance and outrage, the leaders of Bologna and Modena transformed a minor insult into a massive rallying cry. The bucket wasn't just wood and iron anymore, it was identity, pride, and vengeance wrapped into one. Mobilizing for war allowed leaders to unify their citizens. In a fragmented political landscape with fragile coalitions and constant power struggles, war was a shortcut to unity. It created an us versus them narrative. It turned internal divisions into external purpose. And in the eyes of the people, a leader who acted boldly, who took a stand, no matter how reckless, looked decisive, passionate, legitimate. This is the power of emotional spectacle. It overrides rational debate. It silences dissent. It makes a leader untouchable, at least for a time. But behind the flags, the speeches, and the chants, the real story was much darker. Resources were drained, trade routes were disrupted, citizens were taxed more heavily, and young men, most of whom probably couldn't care less about a bucket, were sent to fight and die for pride. This was the economy of war in medieval Italy, a currency of attention, fear, and spectacle, and the rulers who mastered it could rise quickly, but so could the costs. Next, we'll look at how those costs played out, not just in blood, but in coin. So the battle ended, the bucket stayed in Modena, and pride was satisfied, at least for a while. But wars don't just cost lives, they cost systems. They destabilize economies in ways that ripple far beyond the battlefield. Let's talk about what really happened to the market during and after the War of the Oaken Bucket. First, there were the immediate costs. Massive military mobilization meant massive spending. Local treasuries were emptied to fund armor, weapons, food supplies, and mercenaries. That money had to come from somewhere, and it usually came from higher taxes, forced loans, or diverted civic funds. Trade routes, once bustling with grain, cloth, spices, and livestock, suddenly became dangerous. Caravans avoided contested regions. Merchants raised prices to cover risk. Investment slowed. Stability disappeared. And here's the thing, cities like Bologna and Modena weren't just political entities. They were economic engines. Their power came from commerce, from markets, from skilled labor and export networks. So when war disrupted all of that, the damage wasn't just temporary. It discouraged long-term planning. Why invest in infrastructure or trade partnerships when your city might be under siege next month? On a deeper level, war distorted resource allocation. Funds that could have gone into irrigation, roads, trade expansion, or technological improvement were instead funneled into short-term military glory. Instead of building wealth, these cities burned it. And when the war ended, it wasn't like everyone just picked up where they left off. Recovery was slow, trust between cities was shattered, and future disputes became harder to resolve diplomatically, because now there was blood in the soil, anger compounded by economic loss. The war over a bucket had become a textbook example of short-term ego sabotaging long-term prosperity. But what if things had gone differently? What if a more voluntary, decentralized system had been in place, one that could mediate conflicts without swords? Let's explore that next. Now that we've walked through the chaos, the symbolism, the bloodshed, and the economic fallout, it's time to ask the bigger question. What if it didn't have to happen at all? What if there had been a better way to resolve the conflict before it escalated into war? Let's imagine an alternative, a decentralized, voluntary system of mediation between city-states. One where disputes were settled not through blood, but through dialogue. One where pride didn't have to be defended with armies, but could be restored through restitution, reputation, and rational agreement. It's not a fantasy. In other parts of the world, mediation networks existed, networks where third parties helped negotiate peace. Agreements were enforced not by a monopoly on violence, but by mutual interest in stability. Because peace benefits trade, it builds prosperity, and over time, it builds trust. Now imagine if Modena and Bologna had agreed to submit their dispute over the border, or yes, even the bucket, to a council of neutral cities. Cities with skin in the game. Cities that didn't want war because war meant risk, loss, and disruption for everyone. In that system, maybe the bucket would have been returned, or maybe compensated for, or maybe just laughed off, as it should have been. Instead, both cities were trapped in a feedback loop, a system where leaders earned legitimacy through retaliation, where backing down was political suicide, and where diplomacy was seen not as strength, but as weakness. Voluntary systems, when they work, shift those incentives. They reward cooperation over domination. They create reputational costs for warmongering and social capital for peaceful solutions. Would it have worked perfectly? Probably not. But would it have been better than 30,000 men marching to their deaths for an object that held water? Absolutely. So now we're left with a lesson not just about history, but about governance, about the structures we build, and whether they guide us toward reason or ruin. Next, we'll look at what the bucket really meant, and why symbols still carry dangerous weight today. So, let's talk about the bucket. Yes, it was real. Yes, it was stolen. And yes, it's still proudly displayed in Modena to this day. But by now, you've probably realized, this wasn't about a bucket. This was about symbolism, about how simple objects or events, when elevated by emotion, politics, or pride, can ignite chaos. Throughout history, we've seen this pattern repeat. A flag, a statue, a tweet, a shoe thrown in a press conference. Minor acts, minor objects, minor slights that become stand-ins for much deeper tensions. And when leaders or institutions exploit those symbols, they can rally crowds, justify actions, and shift entire nations into conflict. Why? Because symbols bypass the rational mind. They tap into identity, belonging, and fear. They give shape to feelings that are hard to express but easy to weaponize, just like the bucket. So what does that mean for modern policy? It means we have to be careful, not just with what we say or do, but with how we respond to symbolic provocation. It means building systems that prioritize outcomes over optics, and dialogue over displays. It means refusing to let an emotionally charged symbol drive us into irreversible action. And it means questioning the narratives that try to turn small things into sacred things, because behind that transformation, there's often a power grab. The War of the Oaken Bucket is a metaphor for every modern policy built on pride instead of principle, for every escalation sparked by ego instead of evidence, for every leader who stages conflict not to solve problems, but to stay in power. So when we look at history and laugh at the absurdity of a war over a bucket, we should also ask ourselves, what's our bucket, and how far are we willing to go for it? Up next, we close with final thoughts on pride, systems, and the human condition. So here we are, at the end of a story that started with a wooden bucket and ended with thousands of men dead, economies shaken, and legacies rewritten. And it forces us to confront something uncomfortable. The War of the Oaken Bucket wasn't a fluke. It was a reflection of how deeply human beings will defend pride, symbols, and identity, sometimes more fiercely than life itself. What makes this war so tragic isn't just the absurdity of its cause, it's how familiar it feels. We still fight wars over honor, we still fall for political theater, we still allow emotional symbols to override rational decisions, and we still build systems, whether governments, institutions, or ideologies, that reward aggression over humility. But what history shows us, again and again, is that the cost of unchecked pride is almost always paid by someone else. By the young, by the poor, by the merchant who loses his livelihood, by the farmer whose fields become battlefields, by the families who bury their sons while the bucket is paraded like a prize. If we want a different future, we have to build different systems. Systems that reward de-escalation, that question emotional manipulation, that recognize when a bucket is just a bucket, and not a reason to burn the world down. At Truth Behind History, we tell these stories not to mock the past, but to learn from it. Because every absurd war, every forgotten battle, every symbolic spark has something to teach us about ourselves, our structures, and the things we still get wrong. If you found this episode meaningful, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps us bring more forgotten history into the spotlight. You can also listen to this episode, and all our others, on the podcast version. The link is in the description. And if you want to dive deeper into the stories they don't teach you, check out my book, History They Tried to Erase. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and never underestimate what people are willing to fight for.